They left nothing behind but feathers and ash. The rancher never spoke of the tribe that stayed. The silence was different that morning, not the peaceful quiet of dawn breaking over the Montana plains, but something heavier, more deliberate. Samuel Hartwell had been ranching this land for 37 years, and he knew every sound the wind should make through the cottonwoods. This wasn't right. His boots crunched against the frost-covered ground as he stepped off the porch, breath forming small clouds in the October air. The cattle should have been lowing by now, eager for their morning feed. Instead, an unnatural stillness stretched across the valley like a held breath. The first thing he noticed was the fence. 20 yards of barbed wire had been cut clean through, the metal ends twisted into perfect spirals that caught the early light. No tools could have done that. No tools he knew of anyway. Samuel's weathered hands tightened around his rifle as he walked toward the pasture. 43 head of cattle, gone. Not driven off, not scattered by wolves or rustlers. Gone as if they had simply vanished into the morning mist. The ground told no story of hoofprints leading away. No signs of struggle or panic. What remained were the feathers. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, scattered across the grass in perfect patterns that seemed to follow some ancient design. They were unlike any bird feathers he had ever seen, iridescent black that shifted to deep purple and gold when the light hit them just right. Each one was longer than his hand, with an almost metallic quality that made them feel more like crafted artifacts than natural remnants. And beneath them, the ash. Gray powder formed circles around each cluster of feathers, as if something had burned there during the night. But the grass underneath was untouched, still green and alive. The ash was fine as flour, and when Samuel knelt to examine it closer, it seemed to shimmer with the same strange quality as the feathers. 26 years on this land, and he had never seen anything like it. The sound of approaching horses brought him back to the moment. 3 riders crested the hill, their silhouettes dark against the brightening sky. Samuel recognized the lead horse before he could make out the rider. Marshal Tom Brennan rode a distinctive paint mare, and behind him came Deputy Collins and another man Samuel didn't recognize. "Morning, Samuel," Brennan called out as they approached. The marshal's voice carried the kind of tension that came from seeing too many things that didn't make sense. "Had some reports of strange lights out this way last night. Thought we'd ride out and check on you." Samuel gestured toward the field of feathers and ash. "Strange doesn't begin to cover it, Tom." The 3 men dismounted, and Samuel watched their faces change as they took in the scene. Collins, barely 25 and new to the territory, went pale. The third man, older with silver hair and sharp eyes, seemed less surprised than intrigued. "This is Professor William Ashford," Brennan said, noticing Samuel's questioning look. "He's with the Territorial Survey, documenting unusual geological formations. Been tracking some irregular reports across the territory." Ashford knelt beside one of the feather circles, pulling out a small notebook and pencil. "How many cattle did you lose, Mr. Hartwell?" 43 head. Prime stock worth near $800. Samuel's voice carried the weight of a man who had just watched his livelihood disappear. No tracks leading away. No signs of predators. Just gone. "And you heard nothing during the night?" Samuel shook his head. "Sleep sound most nights. But now that you mention it, I did have the strangest dreams. Voices singing in a language I couldn't understand. Felt real enough that I woke up thinking there were people outside my window." Ashford exchanged a look with Marshal Brennan. "Have you seen members of the Blackfoot tribe in this area recently?" "Blackfoot don't come through here much anymore. Not since the treaties pushed them north." Samuel frowned. "Why do you ask?" "There have been similar incidents across 3 counties. Livestock disappearing, these same feathers and ash patterns left behind. Always happens near land that was once considered sacred by various tribes." Deputy Collins had wandered closer to the tree line, and his voice carried a note of alarm. "Marshal, you need to see this." They found Collins standing beside a massive cottonwood, its trunk easily 6 feet across. Carved into the bark were symbols that looked freshly made, despite the fact that the cuts had already begun to heal over. The symbols were intricate, following patterns that seemed to tell a story in pictures. "I've seen markings like these before," Ashford said quietly, "in my research on pre-settlement artifacts. They're not Blackfoot, though. These are older." "Much older?" Samuel studied the symbols, feeling an odd recognition tugging at the back of his mind. My grandfather used to tell stories about the people who lived here before the tribes we know today, called them the Sky Watchers, said they could speak to the spirits of the land, make bargains with forces most folks couldn't even see. Stories, Brennan said dismissively. We need facts, not folklore. Sometimes the two aren't as different as you'd think, Ashford replied. He traced one of the symbols with his finger, a spiral that seemed to draw the eye inward. These patterns match astronomical alignments. Whoever carved them understood the movement of celestial bodies with remarkable precision. The professor opened his notebook and began sketching the symbols, his pencil moving with practiced efficiency. Tell me, Mr. Hartwell, has your family owned this land for long? My father bought it from the territorial government in 1851. Before that, it was open range, but the old-timers used to say it was special somehow. Said the Indians would come here for ceremonies, but they were always respectful about it, never caused trouble. And did your father ever mention any unusual occurrences? Samuel thought back to conversations from decades past. He used to say the land had moods. Some years the grass grew so thick you could barely walk through it. Other years it would go brown for no reason, even with plenty of rain. And sometimes, on clear nights, he swore he could see lights dancing above the valley. Lights? Like fireflies, but bigger. Said they moved in patterns, almost like they were dancing to music only they could hear. Ashford stopped sketching and looked up at Samuel with new interest. When was the last time you saw these lights? I haven't, but my father stopped talking about them after my mother died. Said the land felt different somehow, like it was sleeping. The four men spent the next hour examining the scene, but found no additional clues. The feathers and ash remained untouched by the morning breeze, as if they were heavier than they appeared. The symbols on the tree seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles, creating an optical illusion that made them appear to move. As they prepared to leave, Ashford approached Samuel privately. I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Have you ever felt like you were being watched on this land? Samuel considered the question. Sometimes, usually at dusk, when the shadows get long, like there are eyes in the cottonwoods. But I always figured it was just the natural way of things. Animals watch humans. It's their nature. And have you ever found offerings left on your property? Small bundles of sage, carved stones, anything that might have been left by someone trying to show respect? Now that you mention it, yes. Find them sometimes near the old creek bed. Never thought much of it. Figured it was just travelers passing through. Ashford nodded slowly. Mr. Hartwell, I believe your land sits on what was once a sacred site. The tribes that lived here before European settlement considered this valley a place where the physical world and the spirit world touched. They would have performed ceremonies here, made offerings to ensure good hunting and favorable weather. And you think that's connected to my missing cattle? I think your cattle were taken as part of a much larger ceremony, one that requires very specific offerings at very specific times. Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. You're saying my livestock was some kind of sacrifice? I'm saying that whoever took your cattle believes they were fulfilling an ancient obligation. The question is whether they'll be satisfied with what they took, or if they'll return for more. The marshal had been listening to their conversation with growing unease. Professor, are you suggesting we're dealing with some kind of cult? I'm suggesting we're dealing with people who understand this land in ways we don't. People who see connections between the physical and spiritual worlds that most of us have forgotten. Well, spiritual or not, they stole cattle from a law-abiding citizen. That's a crime in the territory of Montana. Ashford packed his notebook away, his expression thoughtful. Marshal, I've been documenting similar incidents across the Western Territories for 3 years. In every case, the missing livestock belonged to settlers who had built their homes on sites that were once considered sacred by indigenous peoples. And in every case, the animals were never found. You're talking about a conspiracy spanning multiple territories. I'm talking about a response to territorial expansion that we're only beginning to understand. People who were pushed from their ancestral lands are finding ways to reclaim what they consider rightfully theirs. Samuel looked out across his property, seeing it with new eyes. So what am I supposed to do? Just accept that my cattle are gone? I'm going to make some inquiries, Brennan said. See if anyone in the area has noticed unusual activity. But I have to be honest with you, Samuel. If these thieves are as organized as the professor suggests, they're not going to be easy to catch. In the meantime, Ashford added, I'd recommend being more aware of your surroundings. If this land is as significant as I believe it is, last night's ceremony might not be the end of it. The three men mounted their horses and rode back toward town, leaving Samuel alone with his thoughts and the field of mysterious feathers. He walked back to the house, but couldn't shake the feeling that he was being observed, not by hostile eyes, but by something more complex, something that saw him as an intruder in a place that had been sacred long before his family arrived. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Samuel sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and his rifle across his knees. The feathers and ash had remained untouched throughout the day, despite the wind that had picked up in the afternoon. They seemed to belong to the landscape now, as if they had always been there. As darkness fell, he began to notice subtle changes in the sounds around him. The usual chorus of insects and night birds was muted, replaced by something that might have been singing if he listened carefully enough. The melody was unlike anything he had ever heard, haunting and beautiful in a way that made his chest tight with emotion he couldn't name. He found himself thinking about his grandfather's stories, tales of the sky watchers who could speak to the spirits of the land. As a child, he had dismissed them as folklore, the kind of stories old men told to pass the time. But sitting here now, surrounded by evidence of something beyond his understanding, those stories felt more like history. The singing grew stronger as the night deepened, and Samuel realized he could almost make out words in the melody. Not English words, but something older, more primal. The language seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to something deeper, some part of his mind that understood meaning without translation. He dozed in his chair, the rifle still across his knees, and dreamed of figures moving through the darkness. They were tall and graceful, their movements flowing like water over stone. In his dream, they approached the house with reverence rather than threat, leaving offerings on the porch steps before melting back into the shadows. When he woke at dawn, the offerings were real. 3 bundles of sage tied with what looked like sinew, a small carved stone that fit perfectly in his palm, and a single black feather that seemed to shimmer with inner light. The items were arranged in a precise pattern, and Samuel understood somehow that they were meant as payment for the cattle, not theft, but trade. He picked up the carved stone and felt its weight, smooth and warm despite the cool morning air. The surface was covered with symbols similar to those on the cottonwood tree, but these seemed to tell a different story. Instead of the complex astronomical patterns, these symbols were simpler, more immediate. They spoke of gratitude, of balance, of an ancient agreement between the land and those who lived upon it. Samuel made a decision that would have surprised his younger self. Instead of reporting the offerings to Marshal Brennan, he gathered them up and carried them inside. He placed them on the mantel above his fireplace, where they would be visible but safe from the elements. Over the following days, he began to notice changes in his property. The grass seemed greener, more vibrant. The creek that had been running low due to the dry summer suddenly flowed with clear, cold water. His remaining livestock, the horses and chickens he had kept close to the house, seemed healthier and more content. More importantly, he no longer felt alone on the land. The sensation of being watched had changed from something vaguely threatening to something protective. He began to understand that his property was under a kind of guardianship, watched over by forces he couldn't see but could increasingly sense. When Professor Ashford returned 2 weeks later, he found Samuel working in his garden, humming a melody that sounded remarkably like the singing Ashford had heard reports of across the territory. "You look well, Mr. Hartwell," Ashford observed. "I trust you've had no further incidents." Samuel straightened, wiping dirt from his hands. "No incidents, Professor, but I've had visitors." He led Ashford to the mantel and showed him the offerings. The professor's eyes widened as he examined the carved stone, recognizing the symbols immediately. "This is remarkable," Ashford said quietly. "These symbols are a form of communication I've been trying to decode for years. They're a promise, a covenant between the people who made them and the land itself." "What kind of promise?" "Protection in exchange for respect. The stone is essentially a treaty, written in symbols instead of words. Whoever left this is offering to watch over your land in exchange for your acknowledgement of their connection to it." Samuel poured 2 cups of coffee and they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the valley. "I've been thinking about my grandfather's stories," Samuel said. "About the Sky Watchers and their ceremonies. What if they weren't just stories? What if they were historical accounts passed down through generations?" "Exactly. What if the people who took my cattle weren't thieves at all, but descendants of the original inhabitants, still following traditions that go back centuries?" Ashford sipped his coffee, considering the implications. It would explain the precision of the ceremonies, the astronomical alignments, the careful selection of sites. This isn't random activity. It's the continuation of practices that were interrupted by settlement, but never truly abandoned. So what happens now? Now you have a choice. You can report this to the marshal and let the territorial authorities handle it as a criminal matter. Or you can accept that you're sharing this land with people who have a claim to it that predates your family's ownership. Samuel looked out at the field where the feathers and ash still lay in their perfect patterns. "I've been thinking about that, about what it means to own land versus what it means to belong to it. And what conclusion have you reached?" "I think my grandfather was right. The land has moods and it chooses who it wants to nurture. The cattle I lost were probably healthier and more valuable than any I could have raised on my own. And the protection I've gained in return is worth more than money." Ashford made notes in his journal as they talked, documenting what might be the first recorded instance of peaceful coexistence between a settler and the indigenous peoples who had never truly left their ancestral lands. "You realize this makes you unique among the settlers I've interviewed," Ashford said. "Most would demand restitution, organize posses to track down the thieves. Most haven't lived on this land for 37 years. Most haven't felt the way it responds to respect versus exploitation." As if summoned by their conversation, the singing began again as full darkness fell. This time, Samuel didn't find it strange or threatening. Instead, he recognized it as a form of communication, a way for the unseen guardians of the land to acknowledge his presence and his acceptance of their covenant. "Listen," he said quietly, and Ashford leaned forward, straining to hear the melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "It's beautiful," Ashford whispered, "like nothing I've ever heard before." "It's a welcome song," Samuel said, surprising himself with the certainty of his words. "They're letting us know we're accepted here." The professor spent the night on Samuel's porch, documenting the experience and trying to understand the complex relationship between the land, its original inhabitants, and the settlers who had claimed it. By morning, he had filled 20 pages with observations and theories about what might be the most significant anthropological discovery of his career. But when he prepared to leave, Samuel made a request that surprised him. "I'd prefer if you didn't publish anything about this just yet," Samuel said. "Let me have some time to understand what's happening here before the territorial government gets involved." Ashford hesitated. This could be incredibly important for our understanding of indigenous cultures and their relationship to the land. It could also be the end of something beautiful and rare. "Give me a year, Professor. Let me see where this leads." Reluctantly, Ashford agreed. He packed his notes and rode back to town, leaving Samuel alone with his new understanding of the land he had called home for nearly 4 decades. Over the following months, Samuel began to change his approach to ranching. Instead of trying to impose his will on the land, he learned to work with its natural rhythms. He planted crops that were native to the region, raised livestock that could thrive in the natural conditions, and always left portions of his property untouched for the ceremonies he now understood were essential to the land's health. The results were remarkable. His yields increased dramatically, his remaining livestock were healthier than they had ever been, and the land itself seemed to flourish under his new stewardship. More importantly, he felt a sense of peace and belonging that he had never experienced before. On the anniversary of the night his cattle disappeared, Samuel prepared his own offering. He gathered sage from the creek bed, found a smooth stone from the mountain slopes, and added one of his own possessions, a silver pocket watch that had belonged to his father. He arranged them in the same pattern he had found on his porch, and placed them in the field where the feathers and ash had first appeared. The next morning the offerings were gone, but in their place was something extraordinary. A circle of new grass had grown overnight, so perfect and green that it seemed to glow in the morning light. At the center of the circle was a single black feather, identical to those from the original ceremony. Samuel understood that he had become part of something larger than himself, a covenant between the land and all who dwelt upon it. The rancher who had once viewed his property as something to be conquered and exploited now saw himself as a steward, a guardian of traditions that stretched back through generations he could barely imagine. And in the cottonwood tree where the symbols had first appeared, new markings had been carved. These ones were different, simpler, but Samuel understood their meaning immediately. They were a record of acceptance, a permanent marker of the agreement between the seen and unseen inhabitants of the valley. The tribe that had stayed, that had never truly left, had found a way to share their sacred land with a man who had learned to listen to its voice. They left nothing behind but feathers and ash, because they had never gone away at all. Samuel never spoke of the tribe that stayed, not to Marshal Brennan or Professor Ashford or anyone else who might not understand. But sometimes, on clear nights when the stars were bright above the valley, he would sit on his porch and listen to the singing that rose from the earth itself, and he would know that he was exactly where he belonged.